Hey everybody, welcome. In an old Star Trek movie, uh, Spock dies, and they put his body in a photon torpedo tube and launch it toward a planet. And this is the place where the image of Spock's casket near what appears to be an ancient fern was shot. And these are the ferns, the tree ferns. And it was somewhere very near here where that image was shot. I've been looking for a place where I can walk without having to put my mask on and off, though I'm happy to do so if needed. I have so many things on my mind that would be wonderful to explore. But today I'm going to try to talk about a couple of ideas that are very old, and they're associated primarily with magical traditions. And this idea of magic is very deep and peculiar. And it's not like the superficial models and representations and understandings that we have. The ancient peoples were capable of intimacies that we have lost contact with and experience of. And some of these intimacies were encoded in a way in ceremonies, rituals. Now, we still have ceremonies and rituals, we just don't recognize them. Mostly, we don't recognize them as ceremonies and rituals, because we're probably, many of us anyway, are disinclined to think in these terms. But our bedtime activities, what we do before we go to bed, and what we do when we wake up, and when we make food and eat together, and when we go to the store, and when we look at the news, or when we watch a movie. Right? These are actually the remnants in our own daily lives of ceremonies and rituals. Even when we get into our car or we're preparing to go for a walk, if we use drugs, if we smoke or drink or eat things, all of these are modern ceremonies and rituals. And some of them are encoded in laws. It's funny to think about our relationship with traffic lights as ritualistic, and yet they are. Or at least, it can be useful to think of them in this way. And so, when we see indigenous peoples' ceremonies represented on film or recorded somehow, we're seeing something extremely ancient, and it's very different from our modern rituals because of its origins and purposes, and those lie in anciently conserved relationships, old relationships. And when the indigenous peoples have a song, a ceremonial song, this is nothing like, well, it's not true. It bears some small resemblance with our idea of songs. And in fact, there is something kind of magical about some songs. It depends a lot. It depends on many things. But they did not make up these songs. The way that we think of composing, right? This is not like the origins of the old songs. The old songs were transmissions from living places and beings. And when we see the dances, often these are animal dances. These are also transmissions from living beings to humans. They are not made up. They are not composed. They are gifts. And encoding is the wrong word, but it's a familiar word to us moderns. They are gifts that encode a moment when between the humans and the animals, or between the humans and the living places, sometimes between the humans and other humans, something crossed over, a gift. And this gift often involved knowledge that was previously unavailable. And so when we see these old ceremonies enacted, sometimes today, we're not seeing something that was composed. We are seeing something that was transmitted. And in societies like these, there are ceremonies that confer knowledge and safety, and not just physical safety, but protections from what can be understood as powerful forces, protections from what can be understood as negative influences, along with the knowledge and the mysterious shared benefit that can be transmitted between beings. So it is one thing if you see, for example, a squirrel eating a nut and you realize, this nut is edible. There's a transmission that occurs there. But the songs and the dances and the ceremonies, they come from something less pragmatic, more mysterious. They come from something invisible. So that a transmission can be made in a time of crisis or deep need, when people's hearts are alive with hope or fear, and the living world responds and gives the people something valuable. And this might be a song, and it might be a dance, and it might be a ceremony. Now, these are older ways of knowing, and us moderns being unbalanced toward our thinking minds and rationality, and also the models and ideas that we transmit to each other culturally and in language and in concepts. We live in a swarming storm of representations, and Although these are not deep and true transmissions, they are transmissions nonetheless. So in older ways of knowing from other times and places, we find evidence of knowledge and ways of knowing that are unfamiliar to us, and some of us may be inclined to dismiss these as nonsensical or mere superstition. That's a grave mistake, generally speaking. Notwithstanding the fact that many of our experiences of very superficial knowledge paradigms, or paradigms that have collapsed toward mere representations, right? Throughout the ages, these are how shall we say? These are worthy of dismissal, right? These are not worth picking up, yeah, not worth carrying forward. And most of our modern culture is like this. It's not worth carrying. It's not worth picking up. And many of our ideas about, especially our rational ideas about what can't be going on, are very confused. We have this problem with our rationality where it wants to dismiss everything it cannot easily encompass or manipulate in thought with concepts. And that's an unfortunate situation for all of us, because the portion of our humanity or our experience that can be encapsulated or transmitted in concepts and knowledge is extremely thin. It's very tiny, and yet we use it in such a way as to pretend that it's authoritative, powerful, or complete. It is not that our concepts and knowledge have no reality or power, but rather that the contexts in which they have reasonable reality or power are much narrower than they appear to us. And so most of being and relation is invisible and mysterious and charged with potential for transformation, for changing who we are and can be, what our lives are and can be. And you can see that the representational overlays collapse these potentials into extremely impoverished deliverables that nonetheless masquerade as powerful or complete or even true. For something to be true, a measurer mind is involved, a kind of accounting mind. And again, this mind is natural and useful, but when it overpowers the other aspects of awareness and consciousness, we're in very deep trouble. So we moderns don't understand the old people's knowledge very well. And what we refer to as magic, this we are extremely confused about in general. And then there are, of course, subcultures and cohorts that practice what they call magic. In a broad array of costumes. But there are two ideas from magical traditions that I think are useful to examine and play with and gain some understanding of in our modern context. And it's a twin pair of ideas, important in almost all magical traditions, and echoed, or rather, these traditions echo their origins in deep ceremonial intimacy with nature and each other, existence, being, time, light, space, consciousness. And the concepts that I want to explore together are the idea of invocation and the idea of evocation. Now, there are very pragmatic aspects of these concepts. So, to invoke is to bring something within oneself that is transformative. Now, we can see in our cultures all kinds of representations of this. News and media, food, which is probably the primordial one, although oxygen is pretty primordial too. To bring something from without within the self and be thus transformed by it like a seed of potential. And one might say that the ceremonial dances or songs are both invocations and evocations. To evoke is to embody outside the self something. Yeah. So from the magical traditions that involve something like contact with other intelligences, we had names for these other intelligences, and they differed in different times and places. The ones most familiar to us, but these are neither the beginning nor the end of the myriad intelligences that underlie the appearances of physical reality, or maybe overstand them. We have names for these like spirits, angels, demons, so on. And we have this idea of hierarchies and among them and all of this. I'm not terribly interested in that at the moment. I just want to talk a little bit about these two ideas so that we may come to understand them and perhaps be able to gain some knowledge and intelligence about these two ideas, because they're foundational to our being, even though we don't need the language. Right? We don't have to say, I am invoking the spirit of fire when we come to light within, or I am evoking the spirit of fire when I build the fire in the hearth. There are many forms of invocation and evocation, and in fact these can be seen as primordial framings of primordial aspects of being alive. We take something in, we are transformed. We make something outside of ourselves, and we are transformed. An ancient person suddenly transported to modern culture would probably see cars as the evocation of a bad force, a negative influence, a bad spirit, because the cars actually look like monsters. They look like demons, and they're not alive, and they kill by going, right? They kill by just being. I think they would find very little of our evocations to be good or healthy. And so too with our invocations. We read the news, for example, right? And that's taking something in and being changed by it. And that's kind of a representation of having had deep relationships with myriad aspects of living places and beings over time. So that when we would go into the living place, we would be transformed by the news, that which has changed, or that which is emerging, or that which is departing, right? And that sensing of intimacy would come into our being, and we would be transformed by it. And this is the kind of thing that news is a representation of, and you can see how thin and toxic that representation is compared to its origins in lived adventure, role, and relationship. And of course, we evoke as well, right? We make things outside ourselves. The ancient cultures, the very old ones, had no concept of garbage. What they had was a concept maybe of, this is not worth picking up, don't pick that up, not worth taking with you, don't bring that in, not worth preserving, right? But they didn't have garbage because they weren't involved in the mass production of objects. In nature, they found all of their needs and hopes and dreaming met not by things, but heart to heart, met by beings. And so there was communion of beings. And the ancient peoples knew that to depart from this communion meant many troubles and crises. The hubris of our modern society necessarily summons nemesis. These are ideas taken from the Greeks. Hubris could be thought of as arrogant insistence on one's desires or agendas in abeyance of recognition of the relationships that will be changed or damaged or lost if one proceeds down this path. And while they did not probably have these words, they understood this was a very dangerous thing, one of the negative influences. Now in magic, to invoke is to bring another being within oneself, to embody this being, that its intelligences may be experienced in our human form. And to evoke is to cause to appear outside us some form of a being or intelligence that is not human. And so these two ideas are central to magical practice, which most often involves the imagined relation with other beings, non-human beings, non-physical beings often, and humanity, but particularly our own humanity, my personal humanity. And invocations of other intelligences can happen accidentally. But many ceremonies were forged to facilitate these two desires or intentions, these two purposes, these motives. There were what we might think of as very few motives involved. One was the gaining of power. Another was to cause harm to others or another being, an enemy. Another was to cause healing, to trace back the threads of disease or injury, resolve them at their roots, so that healing and health result. And another was to gain intelligence, to answer questions, to pursue quests. And this is something that I think we're very sadly lacking. Our quests have been replaced by representations like jobs and financial success or social relational power. But the acquisition of power, harming, healing, learning. And sometimes, along with the acquisition of power could be the acquisition of wealth, right? Of course, there are different kinds of wealth. There's representational wealth, as in money, and there's interior wealth, as in wisdom, knowledge, intelligence. Now, as I speak, I draw oxygen into my body. My cells transform it, and I exhale carbon monoxide. Or at least this is our very superficial model of something that's going on, because it is not merely oxygen I am drawing into my lungs. Here in this living place, when I inhale, I'm breathing in myriads of molecules, different molecules, biologically, many that have biological origins in microbes and insects and birds and plants, and many that have human origins in industry, right? If we were to carefully examine the composition of what we are breathing, we would find, as we now know, suddenly, that it's filled with myriads of things, not merely oxygen. And we breathe them in, some of those things become part of us forever. Microbes and viruses, for example. So what we are breathing is not merely oxygen, and here you can see the problem with narrow knowledge. Oh, you just need the oxygen, right? So when we put oxygen in a tank to breathe it underwater, it's not the same thing at all that we're breathing when we're outside. Or rather, where it is similar to what we are breathing is very narrow. It's just the chemistry, mostly. And it's true that it's, we need that oxygen in a certain mixture with other gases. But no one who is walking on the face of the earth has ever breathed a breath of just oxygen. You see, here you see again this narrowness, right? Well, what's the utilitarian part? What's the most important part? Well, the accountant who's doing that accounting, the accountant aspect of consciousness, is very useful and important, but too narrow to deliver wisdom. Well, it seems strange to think that I invoke the oxygen and am transformed, and then I evoke the carbon monoxide. And yet, it's not a terrible model. Now, if I'm simply talking with you, and I smile, authentically, we hope, then that may evoke in you an emotion or a response. It also might not. It sort of depends on how you're in. You see, the call of the crows they're evoking in the world, right? Awk, awk, awk. And my attention changes. But the smile evokes a response in you. And humans are extremely sensitive to body and facial language, much more sensitive than they are to spoken language. The owl. Hoo-hoo, hoo, hoo, hoo. Now you see, by making the call of the owl, I'm bringing something of the owl inside me and then embodying it, right? And hearing the owl transforms my attention. Now you can see that many of the activities, functions, and behaviors of modern culture are evocative. We listen to music, we dance, perhaps, or we're like, shut that off. Right? The sound of engines and machines evokes stress in us when brought in. Now, the ancient peoples were very concerned about which kinds of things were good to invoke, to bring in, and be transformed by, and to evoke with our will, to make in the world outside of us, as I am doing with my speech now, transformation. Because they were aware that there are dangers, both within our human nature and within the extended societies that extended not just in place but in time, that we became inclined to form as our indigeneity died out or was killed off by colonization. If I make a fire outside myself and I sit with it contemplatively, I am transformed by this relationship. If we were conscious, more conscious together, of what we are willing to take in and be transformed by, and what we will say no to, and what we are willing to make outside of us with our hands and lives and voices, and what we will say no to. And if we had good traditions and awareness, and we could teach each other and learn together to understand these aspects of our humanity, we could prosper in ways that we've been too timid to dream of in the long sleep of our representational cultures and cognition. In the morning, when the sun rises, I may sing to the sun, "O sun, source of light and life on earth, beautiful one, benevolent, kind star, come inside my heart and live with me and teach me and guide me." Right? This is an invocation to the sun. And of course, these are just words I made up, but I do not speak them without awareness of the actual sun. Even though I am merely trying to give an example. One might say that more than being, more than thing, is actually the origin point for all local existence, for all organisms. It's one of the fundamental progenitors, along with time-space, along with the moon, the closest gravitic body, other than, the Earth itself, whose gravity influences everything on Earth and who has often protected the Earth from impacts that would otherwise have wiped out life. And if I wanted, though I've never done so, I could conceivably try to evoke the spirit of the sun, the beingness of the sun. And in that case, what I would be attempting to do is to bring the intelligence of the sun into expression outside my body but nearby, so that we might converse. And because that's a very dangerous idea, because that being belongs to another universe that we know little of, it would be wise to have various protections and such in place. And these, we can see this idea in the pentagram and the circle, the square, the triangle, the ellipsis, the hyperbola. These shapes were used to contain the evocation so that it would not escape into a context where its power would be overwhelming and could destroy. So when you see the representation of people doing magic, and you see the magical circles and this kind of thing, these are the containers, right, that create a survivable buffer between the embodied world and the world of origin and non-ordinary beings. Now, many people will say, well, there are no non-ordinary beings. It's an interesting and rational perspective. It's impossible for one to know that, however. One cannot say with certainty, oh, there are no non-ordinary beings, right? There are only physical beings. Extremely unlikely that this is true. In fact, it's not even true in physical reality. But I have no intention of pursuing that argument at the moment. What might be more true is that many of the human ideas about non-ordinary beings and relation with them are confused, toy-like representations, commodities, right? We've seen the burgeoning commodification of things referred to as spiritual in the New Age movements, in religions themselves, in the ideas that surround shamanism, even in magical traditions such as Thelema, and perhaps older traditions such as Vodun, Voodoo. Over time, the old ceremonies and knowledge tends to collapse into product, right? Wrappers, right? The wrapper, nothing inside the wrapper. Just we're playing with the wrappers. I think it would be incredibly unlikely for a person with authentic knowledge to be willing to take on the label of magician or shaman or life coach unless they were trying to make money, right? Or to gain popularity. A person of knowledge would resist naturally. A person with real wisdom will resist, it seems to me, advertising it. Yeah. Rather, they will embody it and have little to say about this unless they're asked in a context that they feel comfortable with and trust. And so it's a bit suspicious when someone, to me, and many others like me, when someone walks around making the claim, for example, that they are a shaman, or they are a wizard, or they are a magician, or they are even a witch. Because the badge doesn't matter. Right? The badge is uninteresting. The essence is what matters. And the possibilities are so limitless, right? That to encompass them in this way and produce a deliverable so that I can say like, oh, this is what I do. It's a trap that is very narrow compared to embodying. I am always suspicious of the commodification of what might otherwise become wisdom or intelligence or skillfulness. Perhaps this is because I have seen and in my own way been stung by the incredible poverty that results from the collapse of embodied wisdom and intelligence and care and concern and understanding into representations. It's not always or only bad, right? If it were always or only bad, I would refuse to use language. And that would be an interesting thing to do because it would change what I can be and become as a human being. And also I might despise books, which I do not. Though the wild proliferation of them, I'm a little concerned about. Our representational aspect that dominates most of our waking thought is extremely dangerous and endlessly hungry when it is unguided by, when it is not being constantly informed by intimacy with its origins, and its origins have little to do with concepts or language or thought. They're vastly deeper, and what they really are about is relationships. And those people who think of themselves or call themselves sages or magicians or shamans, and I'm not attempting to denigrate any such people. I'm just merely saying that the willingness to put on the badge, right, to take on the label, is too often related to the desire to sell something. And this is a complex thing, this selling stuff, this commodity stuff. The world of commodities of value that so profoundly impact the lives of millions or billions of people. And mostly they impact them very negatively, and they obliterate the living world, which is the origin of human minds and intelligence and potential, turning them into saleable commodities, hiding the damage in the places, the living places and beings that do not have voices in the way we ordinarily think of having voices. Yet they do have voices. To those of us who have recovered our natural humanity with its capacity. To transform inwardly, in deep attention and awareness to the non-conceptual. the nonverbal. To the feelings that arise when we are intimate with living beings and places, even for just a moment. The subtle movement of the clouds in the sky evokes in me, transforms me inwardly when I give my attention to that. And there is a feeling that is beyond words, before words, after words. The calls of the animals, the foraging of the little bird. But it goes much further than that, because we humans have capacities unimaginable to common moderns. We have the capacity to place our being into another being, so that we can feel the body of the bird in flight as our own, and see my body from its perspective in the sky. And someone will say, "Oh, you're just imagining that." I wish them luck with that objection, because their capacity to forge that objection relies on their imagination. And they might say, "Oh, well, I understand that. What I mean is, this isn't a true form of imagination. This is a game." And I will have the same problem with that objection. Because they're doing the same thing with that objection. They're just not aware of it, because they intend to denigrate the faculty that underlies all other faculties and that integrates them, the imagination. And it's interesting that many old religions have severe admonitions against the forming of images. And even the indigenous peoples were very careful about this, so that if they formed an image for ceremony, that image would be also dissolved and not sustained. That awareness of that danger eroded over time and transformed into its opposite, where now we live in cultures that thrive on billions and producing billions of images per second all over the world. What does that cost? What is lost by doing so? Much. There are vast, unaccounted costs for this, to the degree that now, with our cell phones and technologies and video cameras, surveillance equipment, we're killing ourselves and the living places in order to sustain data, numbers in machines. 1 billion photographs per second. Where does it all go? How is it stored? What must die for that to be sustained? This is the kind of thing the ancient peoples were aware of the danger of, right? But they were also aware of having the imagination frozen and flattened into a representation, so that no more is it within us. Now it's something outside us, and we take it in and we are transformed by it. So the image is intended to evoke, right? We see the image of the angel, or we see the image of the Christmas tree, or we see the image of the influencer, and we are changed, right? So the image is the evocation, our reception is the invocation. You can see this principle at work everywhere in our culture. Advertising is intended to evoke desire, either through similitude, which is a fundamental principle underlying magical thought. The other principle is contagion, right? That things spread. Certain kinds of things can be communicated broadly by simply placing a seed in the right place. Similitude and contagion. My friend Ryan Firstdiver, who you can find on YouTube and who I strongly recommend, is one of the people who understands about these ideas in a deep, non-superficial, and not fundamentally representational way. Right? Like myself, he is aware that theories and models, however interesting they may be, are relatively disposable when placed alongside their origins. And what we would like is access to their origins rather than the theories and models. Now, of course, some of the people who are engaged in, who will take on the label of something, right? I am a guru, I am a teacher, I am a shaman, I am a witch, I am a magician, I am a healer. It's not all bad, right? Some of these people who are willing to wear the badge are deeply authentic, in their way of life. But it's a dangerous trap for the ego, right, to wear the badge. And it can be a way of actually becoming something like the opposite of what is being presented or represented by the name. Because we can easily fall into the representation and lose touch with the origins. I suppose there's another feature of this, of this pair, this invocation, evocation, which is to dismiss. To bring an invocation or an evocation to an end, but also to evict something that has been taken up in a culture or a society, to get rid of that which is not desirable to continue with. And there's a word in magic for this. It's just escaping my the grasp of my vocabulary at the moment. Let me think. Of course, in some religions or practices, there's the idea of exorcism, which is to evict, right, something that has come into someone. But we can think of this more pragmatically. We can think of it in the sense that, say I have a habit that is harming me, and I'd like to replace that with a habit that is helpful or healthy, or to simply stop harming myself, right? It is this kind of thing. I change course so that the hooks of the habit, they slide off of me rather than gaining purchase and restructuring my life. This potential for something in us, which we might call the traveling aspect of awareness, the aspect that can go outside of our body and travel. This was well known by the ancients and largely dismissed by the moderns as mere superstition. But please believe me when I say to you that there are faculties within you in your human interiority. And actually, I don't mean please believe me. Please go find them, recover them, for you will know great joy in recovering them, and you will be endlessly shocked. You will never get over your surprise at the powers inherent in our humanity. The power to directly inhabit another being with the traveling aspect of our essence. Yeah. As if our soul has organs and one of them can go into other beings and living places and dwell within them and communicate back to us from there, or even for the other being, like the bird or the raccoon or the mouse, for us to go with them in their world, in their body, with our awareness. And you know, it's natural for us to feel sympathy, which is to resonate with, and empathy, which might be thought of as to form a receptive body for the feelings and experiences of others. And in the first case, sympathy, it's almost like we become the other, right? They cry, I cry, right? With them, half as them. And with empathy, and of course these words can mean different things for different situations, but with empathy it is more that I feel deeply the resonance of the other without collapsing entirely into it, so that I still have a kind of local integrity, right, of my own. To go with, yeah, to go with others in their feelings. And the capacity of the traveling body is more like, the capacities of this traveling body are more like sympathy, right? Becoming the other. But it's natural for us to sympathize and empathize, and this is actually why we like to watch videos and movies and things. And it's also why, you know, if we see someone harmed, we may feel pain. And we also have some sense of justice and injustice, right? Like that harming is wrong, I must intervene. Or that harming is somehow righteous and I must participate. That's a more confusing idea, but we've all felt angry or vengeful. We've all been subject to retribution or enacted it in our lives in some ways. But it is this aspect of our interiority that can inhabit another being or living place or moment or situation that I hope you may pursue the recovery of. Watch the bird. Imagine that its body is your body. Feel its wings as they pulse, right? Feel its head move as it surveys the terrain. Look where it looks. Imagine seeing what it sees. Imagine feeling the shape of its body as your body. And as you continue this process, your mere imagination will eventually open up like a flower, and you will have the direct experience of being an animal, or a tree, or a living place. And it's tragic that we live as and die as human beings without this experience because of blah, 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 blah. Right? There's some fucking authoritative guy, judge thing, doesn't have to be gendered. There's this thing, this accounting thing, and it wants to say like all of that is just nonsense, I have no experience of that. Okay, you have no experience of it. If you have no experience of it, perhaps you're not entitled to say it's not true or, you know, accessible. In fact, we're not just born with senses, we're born with myriads, endless potential senses, and if they are not developed, we live our lives as if they don't exist. And so one of the most beautiful things we can do together as human beings is to work together to recover these faculties to our direct experience. And by this, I do not mean form religions, right? Or theories, or models, or even language. I actually mean recovering senses. And they are not verbal, they are not conceptual. And our imaginations and our hearts are deeply woven into these potentials that most of us will live and die never experiencing, or we may experience them for a brief moment and be very surprised, but we will go back to sleep, right? We will go back to sleep in the conceptual, rational, pseudo-logical, right? Because none of us are actually logical. We may employ logic, but there are no Spocks among us. Though there are neurodivergents who resemble something like this. Often they're profoundly impoverished, because if one dwells in logic and modeling and computation, then it's easy to evict most of the faculties that might otherwise connect us with each other, with our origins, with our essence, with our interiority, with the invisibles. So I had it in my mind to reflect briefly on invocation and evocation. These old ideas that are all around us all the time. We're constantly evoking, invoking, in all kinds of ways that are totally commonplace to us. We just do not think in these terms usually. And even those who have formally, ceremonially invoked or evoked beings or principles, they may have a very narrow idea of what invocation or evocation might be. Well, some of them may have deep and very rich ideas about these things. Nonetheless, they recognize the difference between the ideas and being, becoming, that toward which the language, models, and ideas point. Yeah, that which they point toward. They know the difference, right, between the idea, the word, and that toward which it points, which is unspeakable. Though we could call it by various names. We might call it sympathy, we might call it empathy, we might call it transformation of our interiority. So I had this idea to reflect on these words briefly the other night. And my wanderings today have only very imperfectly embodied my intention. Nonetheless, it's fun. And I learned so much by trying to speak of these things, which is a really important part of why I make videos, right? Because I'm relating, evoking and invoking with aspects of my human interiority that are very difficult for me to relate with intellectually or in language unless I decide to walk on that bridge between the two, right? Reflecting both on the concepts, language, and ideas, and on the unspeakable invisibles they point toward. And I like to come more on the side of the latter, to remember and to honor, to have reverence and wonder and awe for the astonishing depth of our nature as living beings, as human beings, and as essential beings, what we might call spiritual beings or soulful beings. And of course, I am rarely satisfied with my talks. They are essays in the sense of an attempt, right? I think the word essay means to attempt, to try. But I am grateful for those of you who wander with me and help me to grow and learn, and grant me some of your attention. And hopefully my wanderings may evoke in you the desire to explore and learn and rediscover and recover the living library of faculties innate in our lives as human beings, largely denied, represented, commodified in our modern cultures. So thank you. I'm grateful to have this time together. And I hope that we shall wander and learn, explore and quest together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.